Open your Bibles to the text that was just read this morning, Job chapter 2, verses 1 through 13. Job 2, verses 1 through 13. You know, we will never know all the reasons. We never can see behind the curtain completely. We'll never know the depths of the riches, of the wisdom, of the knowledge of God. Once in a while, we can maybe catch a ray of purpose. We can catch a ray of why things happen, but we will never know 100% why things happen the way that they happen. I'll never forget sitting with somebody that was dealing with a very difficult family situation, and on top of a family situation, this particular person was also dealing with a very heavy physical situation that was potentially terminal to his life. He didn't know the Lord. And because of the struggles he was having in his life, our paths crossed. Because of what he was dealing with, he and I began to meet together to talk about his suffering and to talk about spiritual things. I can't count the number of times in our meetings together that he asked the question, why? And often it was followed up with this, I just don't understand. And then he would say, I have tried my entire life to be a good person. I've tried my entire life to be the best person I can be. I just don't understand why bad things are happening to me. And he would ask me those questions, and I would try to push those questions off because ultimately he didn't understand the gospel, and that was the most important thing for him to understand, and so I kept driving him to gospel crucial questions. As we met through the weeks, he moved closer and closer to an understanding of the gospel, and then the day finally came. The day came that he realized he was a helpless sinner. The day came that he stopped saying things like, I've tried hard to be my best. I've tried hard to do good things my entire life. The day came where he stopped saying those things and realized that before God he was a helpless sinner, and realized that Jesus had taken the penalty for his sin on the cross, and he believed and trusted in that. And he believed and he trusted in the applied righteousness of Jesus Christ on his account, and he was saved on that day. I'll never forget that moment. It was a special day to see somebody come to faith in Jesus Christ. After he came to faith, we sat and chatted for a while, and I gently and cautiously said to him this, you have been through a lot. However, you realize that without these trials in your life, that we would not have met? Do you realize that without this suffering in your life, that we would not have started meeting together, that we wouldn't have done this Bible study together, and it was through these trials, it was through these things that have happened to you, that you came to truly understand the gospel? And it was like a light bulb went on in his mind as he realized how God had used the suffering in his life to ultimately save him. Now, we may not always know those reasons. And Job certainly didn't know the reason for his suffering, and at this point in the text, you really got a feel for Job. And when we left him last week, Job had just learned that his wealth was gone, his servants were dead, and all of his children had been killed in the collapse of a house upon their heads. And you weep with those who weep, and you feel for Job's pain. And we're going to pick up the story at that point. But if the book had ended after one chapter, it wouldn't necessarily be a happy ending by any means, but at least if the book had ended right there, we know that God had won, Satan had lost, and Job's faith had been intact. That's where we left off. And the book could have ended there. It certainly wasn't a happy ending, but at least at this point, God's won, Satan's lost, and Job's faith is intact. But the story does continue. And I want to walk through the story with you here this morning. Job chapter 2, starting in verse 1, we have a reprisal of what happened before, a resumption of events that took place, and it sounds very much the same as it begins in chapter 2. One day the sons of God came again to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came with them. So this isn't the same scene. This is a different day, a different scene. The sons of God, meaning the angels, are coming to present themselves before the Lord, as we talked about a few weeks ago. It seems that there's times where the angels have to come and give a report, where they organize themselves, where God tells them that you're going to do different jobs and tasks, and they come and they give progress reports. Different day, different scene, same type of report. But I want you to notice something interesting here. It says in the text that Satan also came with them to present himself before the Lord. Now in the first chapter it said that Satan just happened to be there. And now it says that Satan came to present himself before the Lord. I believe that Satan had to come present himself before the Lord. Satan had just lost the bet to God. There's no reason why Satan, on his own volition, would come to the Lord. You would think that he would be hiding at this point because he's lost the bet. But there he is, presenting himself. And I think he had to present himself. I think God required that he came and gave a progress report of how things were going. And at this moment in the text, it just makes me remember that God does carry out his administration of this world in a unique fashion. As we talked about 2 weeks ago, God carries out his administration of this world in a monotheistic mediation. In other words, he uses supernatural and natural forces to administer his rule on this planet. And so, though God is ultimately responsible for everything that happens, he isn't the cause of evil. And so you have this tension of Satan coming and giving a report to God for the things that he's done, but because he's giving a progress report, God ultimately is responsible. And so there's a reprisal of what took place before, and secondly, we see a rebuke. And God says in verse 3, the Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job?" Now just think about this for a moment with me. I kind of hear a little bit of sarcasm in God's voice. I kind of hear a little divine trash talking, if you will. Hey, Satan, what about Job over there? You'd imagine this scene in your mind. Look at Job. Have you thought about Job? Have you considered my servant Job? And he goes on and says, no one else on earth is like him, a man of perfect integrity who fears God and turns away from evil. That's exactly what he said before, but then God adds one more thing to it, and he says this: he still retains his integrity. He still retains his integrity, even though you incited me against him to destroy him for no good reason. I love God's language here. Again, it's like divine trash talking. It's like God saying, see, I told you so, Satan. Poor Job suffered for no reason because, as I figured, he's the real deal. I won, you lost. Those are great moments, aren't they? Can't you just hear God kind of glorying in the fact that he won and Satan had lost? And I do think it's important, again, to parse out some of these words here. It says, you incited me against him for no good reason. And one might think that God's being flippant about the suffering of Job, but he's not being flippant about the suffering of Job. God does not pleasure in the suffering of Job, but the suffering of Job was important to vindicate God's glory. God says here, you incited me for no good reason. There's a difference between acting without purpose and acting without reason. And let me just tell you this: God never acts without purpose. God does everything with a purpose. And that purpose is for his glory and for our good. And Job's integrity is intact. His integrity has remained, even though he's gone through intense suffering. What does it mean that his integrity remains? Well, it means that his reason for worshiping was sincere and genuine. His reason for worshiping was not to get a paycheck in return, because once the paycheck was pulled away, guess what? Job was still worshiping. His integrity was intact. Sometimes you see people that don't have good integrity with the things that they do. I don't know if you've experienced this before. I've had this happen to me. I've been in a store, been somewhere out in public, and you strike up a conversation with somebody and you realize they're just really friendly. They seem to really want to get to know you for some reason. You're like, oh, this is interesting. That's kind of cool. It's a good conversation with somebody. You talk for a while. You're like, man, they are just super friendly. And then it comes, you say, what do you do for a living? They say, oh, I'm self-employed. Oh, really? Interesting. Where are you self-employed? And then it comes out, oh, it's Amway. Okay, I see where this is going. It's one of these pyramid schemes, and you're being nice to me. Why? To get a future customer. And so you see an integrity issue there. The reason they were being nice to me is not because they wanted to be nice to me, it was because they saw me as a future customer. And so what God says here about Job is that his integrity stayed intact. He was not worshiping me simply to get in return, because once that was pulled away, his integrity, his reason for worshiping, remained. So there's a reprisal of what's happened before. There's a rebuke, and now there's a rematch, verses 4 and 5. A rematch between God and Satan. Look with me in your Bibles. It says, "Skin for skin," Satan answered the Lord. "A man will give up everything he owns in exchange for his life, but stretch out your hand and strike his flesh and his bones, and he will surely curse you to his face." What is Satan saying here? We're not exactly sure what skin for skin means. The phrase is a little fuzzy in the original language, but what it means, I believe, is that Job, as Satan says, had willingly traded the skins of his children and his servants for his own. That Job was okay as long as his own body stayed intact, that he was willing to trade in everybody else except for himself. And Satan says, strike Job's skin, and then this will be a different story. Now, I want you to see again in the text of Scripture what's so interesting about the language here in the conversation. Verse 4, "Skin for skin, Satan answered the Lord. A man will give up everything he owns in exchange for his life." Look at verse 5. "But stretch out your hand and strike his flesh." Again, we're met with this idea that God is ultimately responsible, though he's doing this through the administration of Satan. It's very perplexing to try to figure that out, but there's a few different phrases that indicate that. In chapter 1, verse 11, Satan says to God, "Stretch out your hand." In chapter 2, verse 3, God says, "You incited me against Job." And now in chapter 2, verse 5, Satan again says, "Stretch out your hand." And so we cannot remove God's responsibility in his culpability out of this scenario. Ultimately, God is responsible for what happened to Job, though he was not the cause of evil. It's very difficult to figure that out, but it's important to know that. It's important to know that in your life. It's important to know that when bad things happen and when trials and suffering come, that God is not powerless, that he's not in heaven trying to somehow pull together a plan B because plan A failed somehow, and now he's scrambling to get in control of your situation. Listen, God has always been in control of your situation. No matter what it is, God is in control. And so there's a rematch. Satan is not going to go down without a fight. And the rematch leads to revenge, verses 6 through 8. Look what it says in the Scriptures. "Very well, the Lord told Satan, he is in your power, only spare his life." So God put parameters on Satan, and again we learn that Satan is on a leash. Satan can only do what God allows him to do. Only spare his life. You can inflict him with pain, but spare his life. Verse 7. And you can just sense the revenge here for Satan. He's lost. He's not happy about losing. And so he's going to make it as bad as he possibly can for Job. Verse 7, "So Satan left the Lord's presence and infected Job with terrible boils from the soles of his feet to the top of his head. And then Job took a piece of broken pottery to scrape himself while he sat among the ashes." I don't think there's any image in the book of Job that's so poignant as this. When you think of the book of Job, when you think of the character of Job, I don't know about you, but I think of him sitting outside the city on a pile of ashes with boils from the top of his head to the soles of his feet, scratching himself with a piece of broken pottery. That's the image I have of Job because it is so striking when you read that in the text. And man, you really got a feel for Job, don't you? We don't exactly know what the condition was that he had. It calls it festering boils, much like what happened in Egypt when God struck the Egyptians. But as we piece together through the Scriptures what his condition was, here's some of the descriptors we have throughout the book. Job's afflictions: it was inflamed, ulcerous sores. There was itching involved, degenerative changes in facial skin, loss of appetite, depression, loss of strength, worms inside of the sores, oozing and running sores, difficulty breathing, darkness under the eyes, foul breath, loss of weight, continual pain, restlessness, blackened skin, peeling skin, and fever. Anybody had something like that before? I don't think we can't quite imagine the suffering that Job endured as Satan was unleashed to give Job his absolute worst. The physical aspects are horrific to think about, but then there's the social element as well, as Job is an outcast. Job was once a figure in the city of respect, and now he's sitting outside the city, rejected. A man that's basically left for dead on the trash pile outside of the city. This is intense suffering. So Satan gets his revenge. And then to make matters worse, in verse 9 we have his wife who calls for Job to retreat. Look what it says in verse 9. His wife said to him, "Are you still holding on to your integrity? Curse God and die." And I like what Job says. He's so wise here. Job does not call his wife foolish. Do you notice that? That's a smart man right here. Even in the midst of all these trials, Job's still pretty wise. Look what he said in verse 10. "You speak as a foolish woman speaks." So his wife could say, "You called me foolish." "I didn't call you foolish. I said you're talking like a foolish woman." Smart guy, even covered in boils. He's still smart. "You speak as a foolish woman speaks," he says. Should we accept only good from God and not adversity? Throughout all of this, Job did not sin in what he says. And so even the one who's closest to him, his only living family member that's left, tells him to retreat from his integrity. The great church father Chrysostom called Job's wife the devil's best whip. Calvin calls Job's wife organum satani, which is Latin for an instrument of Satan. Let's just say Job's wife doesn't have a great reputation with the commentators on the book of Job, as she tells him to retreat from his integrity, to throw in the towel. Essentially, what Job's wife is asking him to do is to commit suicide, because if you curse God, she knows if you curse God, there's a chance that God might strike him dead. And so she's asking Job to commit suicide. Just throw yourself into the hand of this God and commit suicide. Your life is not worth living anymore. But Job comes back with a very theological response. And instead of cursing God, in fact, far from cursing God, Job says, "Shall we receive only good things from God's hand and not adversity? Are we not supposed to receive both good and bad? Is God not able to give us both good and bad? And should we not worship in both good and bad? We willingly accept the good from God's hand, don't we? Should we not also accept the things that come our way that aren't so good? So what does it mean for us to maintain our integrity in times like this? What does it mean for us to cling to our theology of God? Next week we're going to see the response of Job, the response of a broken man. And Job answers carefully in chapter 3. His response is carefully worded. He's carefully saying things so that he doesn't sin against God with his words. God is love. God does give good things. And if we trust Him for the good things, we can trust Him in the collapse as well. But we must be careful when these things happen. We must be careful not to question God's justice in the middle of difficult circumstances. Because when we question God's justice in the middle of hardships, we're essentially saying that we know better than God. We're essentially saying that, God, I can out-God you at being God. We're essentially saying to God that we're more righteous than Him. And when we get angry at God, we're implying that God has done something wrong and that God could be more righteous. Let me just say it like this. There's no reason, there's no time, there's no room for a believer to ever be angry at God. Because when you lash out in anger against God, you're telling Him, you're impugning Him of unrighteousness. And you're telling Him that you could out-God God and do His job better than He could. We don't respond in anger. We respond as Job did, as it says in verse 10. Throughout all of this, Job did not sin in what he said. At least this point, he's not. Later, he does sin. And he repents of that, and we're going to see as the series unfolds. You know, it's interesting, at the end of verse 10, you just wonder, don't you? If I was writing this book, if I was God, wouldn't you maybe think Job's had enough? If I was writing this story, if I was God, if Satan came to me and said, all right, God, let's do a rematch. If I was God, wouldn't you maybe say, you know what? He's had enough. Job's already suffered more than any person's ever suffered. Job's already been through enough. Satan, isn't that enough for you? Job's already proven his worth. He's proven that his worship is genuine. Enough is enough. Do you feel that way when you read the book of Job? Get to the end of chapter 1, it just seems like, man, it's enough. And then it goes to chapter 2, and God allows this to happen again. It just seems if I was God, if you were God, man, wouldn't you just say, enough's enough? But God doesn't do that. Why doesn't God do that? Because God is worthy of worship and God's name needs to be vindicated. And ultimately this morning I want you to see this big idea, and this is important for us to all understand this point, that God's glory is more important than my comfort. God's glory is always more important than my comfort. And God's glory here was still on the line. God's name was still at stake. God was still being impugned by Satan. And so God needed to be vindicated, and Job needed to be vindicated, and God's glory needed to be defended. And the way God's glory was going to be defended was by Job suffering even more than he had already suffered. And that's true in our lives as well. God's glory is always more important than my comfort, because at the end of the day, God's glory is the only thing that matters. God's glory is the only thing that truly satisfies. And for me to see more of God's glory is the most loving thing that God can do for me, even if it takes suffering for me to see more of God's glory. That's still the most loving thing that God can do for me. And we need to understand that fact, that even though suffering's tough and even though things might seem unfair, that at the end of the day, God is still God and God is still love, and He is at His core a God of love. He is at His core a Father, and He can do nothing that is unloving. Therefore, everything that comes from His hand into our lives is in some way an expression of His love for us, to expand His glory in our lives and in other people's lives. God's glory is always more important than our comfort. Well, as we move on from verse 10, we cue stage right the Three Stooges to come in. Larry, Moe, and Curly is their names. Actually, it's Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, his three friends who come and give him advice and begin to talk to him. And we're going to learn a lot more about them in the weeks to come and what they had to say to Job and the different things. They had great theology in some ways, but they were so far off base in other ways and really led Job down a wrong path. Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, they coordinated a trip together. It says in verse 11, now when Job's three friends, Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite, heard about his adversity that happened to him, each came from his home, and they're coming from different places, so they had to coordinate to get there. So we see that this took time. We see that Job's suffering was a longer period of time because his friends had to coordinate this trip, and they coordinated this trip to come and to encourage Job. They wanted to be an encouragement to him, but I believe they were probably shocked at what they saw. It says in the text of Scripture in verse 11, they heard about all the adversity that happened to him. Each one came from his home, and they met together to sympathize with him and to comfort him. Look at verse 12. When they looked at a distance, they could barely recognize Job. They wept aloud, and each man tore his robe and threw dust into the air and on his head. Well, that's a stunning verse, isn't it? To think about going to see your friend and not being able to recognize him. Somebody said it like this: as they catch their first glimpse of their old friend, they are appalled. And when they saw him from a distance, they did not recognize him. The smoking rubbish heap was often piled higher than the city itself, so we may imagine them approaching the city and spying this lonely figure crouched on the landfill pile in the distance. They knew it was Job. Probably they had been told in advance that he was there. We may suppose that he was now by a well-known sight in the region, but they could hardly believe it was really him. Is that Job? We might imagine one saying to another. So thin, so pale, so harrowed with pain and grief, and as they approached him, they shrink back in horror. And his three friends come and approach him to comfort him. And then there's a verse Verse 13, that's so perplexing and so outside of anything that we can imagine. I've read this before. I've heard the story many times before, and it always strikes me. I think maybe if I read the verse a different way, maybe it's a translation issue. Maybe I'm not understanding something right. But these three friends come to Job, and look what it says in verse 13. They sat on the ground with him 7 days and 7 nights. And no one spoke a word to him because they saw his suffering was intense. Can you imagine that? Can you imagine going to visit somebody in the hospital and sitting for 7 days and 7 nights and not saying a word to them? But sometimes the best thing you can do for a suffering person is to just be with them. Just sit with them. To not try to give them quick and easy answers, because, friends, there really are no quick and easy answers to intense suffering of righteous people. And they just sit. And in that culture, it would seem maybe there was a custom that the person who was suffering was to speak first. And so they were waiting for Job to speak, and Job does speak here in chapter 3. But they waited with him 7 days and 7 nights. They seem to be true friends as they're there to comfort Job. More from them in the weeks to come. But for now, as we wrap up chapter 2, I want to give you some things to think about here this morning, because I think in our minds, it's hard to wrap our heads around what happened to Job, and it's hard when this happens in our lives as well. And I think there's different suffering that comes into our lives, and people give bad advice, and we're trying to figure out the source of the suffering and how all this works together. So what I wanted to do for the rest of our time here this morning is to give us some categories of suffering. Categories of suffering, just to help us understand a little bit how suffering works and where it comes from. Because probably of the things in the book of Job that are hard to understand, it's, again, the question of why suffering happens and where it's coming from. And so to give some categories for us, we maybe begin to understand a little bit better about how this works and why it happens. The first category of suffering that I think that people have in their lives comes from reaping and sowing. God has set in motion a certain set of rules or truths that He's built into this world. And when you go against one of the rules that He set into place, there will be consequences. If I were to leave this room and climb up a ladder to the top of the building and stand at the peak of the cross by that window and say, I'm going to pretend I'm Superman. Let's see how this works. Now, what's going to be the end of that fun little adventure? Jump off the roof, and what happens? Of course, I rip my shirt open, there's an S right here, and I start flying, right? That's what you're all expecting is going to happen. Probably not. I'm going to fall. I'm going to land on the ground. I'm going to experience what happens when you break the rule of gravity. God has put together certain rules for the planet. And in many cases, we are reaping and sowing. We're constantly sowing things in our lives, and we reap as a result. Reaping and sowing, sowing and reaping. And God is not necessarily always stopping those things from happening. He doesn't stop the reaping from the sowing. He doesn't keep you from reaping the results of bad choices. Now let me just get you all involved here this morning. How many of you, by raise of hands, this is honest here this morning, how many of you in your life ever, by a raise of hands, have ever made a bad choice in your life? Let me see your hands. Wow, I'm just checking to see if there's any liars here today that have their hands down, all right? You made a bad choice, and some people are raising 2 hands. I didn't know if that's just a confession or a charismatic moment. I'm not sure which one. Bad choices. Now, how many of you have made a bad choice and you've reaped a bad consequence for a bad choice? Let me see your hands. Anybody? Yeah, I think all of us at some point, right? That's happened to all of us. And so there's certain suffering that comes because of a bad choice. Are there times that you've made a bad choice and somehow by God's grace you were let off the hook for something that you did that was a bad choice? Anybody been there before? Boy, probably more times than we'll ever know, right? So there's a certain reaping and sowing in our own lives. We sin, we make choices, and we do things, and there's consequences that come, and sometimes those consequences result in suffering. Now, here's another layer of this reaping and sowing. There's also reaping and sowing of the people around us. There's reaping and sowing of people that are in our lives, things that we're not doing on our own, but things that other people are doing. So all of us here this morning have parents. That's a pretty safe bet. I think we all have parents. None of our parents were perfect. Let me see you raise a hand. Anybody say you have absolute perfect parents? Let me see your hands. Now, those of you who are sitting with your parents, you'd be wise to raise your hands right now for brownie points today. All right. None of us have perfect parents. All of us have parents that have made bad choices and have not done everything perfectly. And the result of parents who don't do everything perfectly, in some cases, results in some kind of effect. There are certain insecurities that we all have because of our upbringing, things that happened in our upbringing. That just happens. That's part of life. There's reaping and sowing of people's decisions in other ways, not just your parents, but other people around you as well. Listen, I'm in Iowa today because I went to school here, because I was connected to a school through my parents, because they were connected to this, and you just kind of chain that back. And the reason why we're all here today is a result of choices that were made before us that we didn't make. But there's a reaping of those choices. And so all of us, in some way, we are experiencing suffering because of choices that we made, or we're experiencing suffering because of choices that other people made in our lives. And that is just part of life, and God does not stop that from happening. Let me just go one step further than that. A lot of times, people's health problems, not all the time, but in some cases, health problems come as a result of reaping and sowing. So the person that smoked their entire life and they're dying of lung cancer, they say, "Why is this happening, God?" Well, I can tell you why it's happening. I have maybe an idea of why that's happening. There's a reaping and sowing as it relates to health. And so if you have certain health things, there's a chance that maybe certain patterns in your life cause that to happen. Okay? Too many donuts, too much McDonald's, too many Whoppers at Burger King. There's an end result to that that's not healthy. Am I telling you anything new this morning? You all knew that, right? So there's reaping and sowing that sometimes results in suffering. That's a layer of suffering. God's not inflicting it, Satan's not inflicting it, it's just what happens through a natural course of life. Number two, I would call this dirt transfer from living in a sin-cursed world. This is part of suffering as well. Did you know that we live in a sin-cursed world? Did any of you know that here this morning? Did you know that things are not perfect in this world? Have you noticed that as you've lived? Do you notice that things maybe are even not perfect, but even like as far away from perfect as possible, that there's bad things that happen in this world? And guess what? We live in that world. We are part of that sin-cursed world. When you get saved, when you come to know Jesus as your Savior, God does not put you into a space suit to keep you unstained from the sin of this world. God does not put you in a bubble that keeps you protected from everything that happens in this world. We live in a sin-cursed world, and as a result of that, some people get cancer. Some people die before they should, you can say. Some people lose everything in an economic downturn. Some people see their house destroyed in a tornado. All of those things happen because we live in a sin-cursed world. If God preserved believers from these types of suffering, it would become a wrong reason for people to want to become a believer. Just think about that for a moment. Let's just say that God said, as soon as you become a believer, you are spared from all of that. How many people would be lining up to become Christians? But that wouldn't be the right reason. That puts God's integrity, that puts His name at stake, because we're not to be worshiping because of the incentives we get. We're to be worshiping Him because He's worthy of worship. So God does not preserve us from the things that happen in a sin-cursed world. Number three, there's also, as we've learned from Job so far, satanic meddling. Now, I would encourage you, don't dwell too long on the first two chapters of Job, or you will live your life completely freaked out about Satan. Anybody else there with me? Anybody else reading these? You're like, what is going on? Does Satan still do this today? Like you read these first 2 chapters of Job, and honestly, it's terrifying, isn't it? I mean, look what Satan is able to do. Satan encourages acts of terrorism. Satan is able to bring a whirlwind to destroy the house of Job's kids. I mean, the things that he's able to do, and then in chapter 2 now, he inflicts Job with sores from the tops of his head to the soles of his feet. He can bring physical infliction into your life as well. Satan has great power to do things like this. Now again, don't dwell too much on those first 2 chapters or you're going to live scared, right? A couple of weeks ago, I got into a project of painting my house. And I was up on ladders, very high ladders. There was a plank between 2 ladders. I just took a picture for you to see this. I thought it was kind of fun. You're going to have to orient where you're at with this. I am on this ladder all the way up the peak of my house, and I'm looking down. I'm taking the picture down. There's my feet. And I'm on an 18-inch plank with nothing securing me in the back, doing work like this, and you lift your head, you get a little bit disoriented, and so I just tried to kind of keep a hand on the roof, and you're kind of moving, and one misstep, and you're gone, right? Anybody's palms getting sweaty at this point as you're seeing that? Like that kind of makes you a little nervous seeing that drop. There were a number of times throughout this process of painting my house as I'm up on ladders and doing these things that I thought, and I actually prayed this. You might think I'm crazy. I said, Lord, if you want to take me out, this is your chance. Right? Because he could do it. He could do it at that moment. You got a great chance, Lord, if you want to take me out. But then the last time I was up on one of these ladders, after I had been reading Job 1 and 2, I shouldn't have read Job 1 and 2 and then got up on one of these ladders again. It wasn't good for my soul. I thought, man, you see Satan's power in Job 1 and 2. All he could do is just come and just tweak something on that ladder and suddenly, boom, it's gone. And he could do that, right? He has power to do that. We've seen that in Job 1 and 2. And so as you're thinking about that, his power to do those types of things, listen, Satan wants to destroy everybody. If Satan could have his way, he would kill the entire population of the planet today. Satan's name is the destroyer. Satan loves to ruin God's creation. If Satan would have the leash to do it, he would kill everybody today. What keeps him from doing it? I'll tell you what keeps him from doing it is God. God keeps Satan on a leash. God keeps Satan from doing this. Satan has to ask permission of God to do whatever he's going to do. And so this really does change the way you view God, because it seems, in my view at least, that 99.9% of the time God is keeping us from suffering and keeping Satan from doing various things that he could do. And sometimes when you read the book of Job, the first couple of chapters, you see God allow Satan to do this, and you think, oh, God allows him to do that. But I think we need to change the way we view it. I think God most of the time is keeping Satan from doing things, and for that I'm thankful. I'm thankful that I'm standing here today and I didn't fall off of a ladder, or that God didn't allow Satan to do something like that on a ladder. God's preserving us. By and large, that's what God is doing, is preserving us in our lives. And we should be thankful for his preserving hand. Number 4, another category of suffering is what I like to call God's divine paddle. What does that mean? That means that if you're a true child of God, that there will be times in your life that God will chastise, discipline you as a child. Now, unfortunately, this is where we often run first. When something bad happens in our life, we think, what did I do? But when God does this, what we read from Scripture is this is almost a last option. This is a time when a believer has been in sin and continuing in sin, and God does something drastic to get a believer's attention. When this happens in your life, it's not something you wonder about. You don't ask the question, what did I do? If something happens and you are in sin, you know that this is happening. This is not a mystery, okay? When you are a believer and you're walking in known sin, habitual sin, you're rebelliously going your own way, you can expect a little swat on the backside from God's divine paddle. And that is a category of suffering, though I think this is a minor category. It's a smaller, this doesn't happen often, and so this should not be the first place that we run in our minds when suffering happens. And so, this morning we see again, God's glory is more important than our comfort. And so what do we do? What do we do when things happen? What do we do in one of these categories in our lives if suffering happens? Maybe you don't understand the trial. Maybe you can't explain it. Job certainly couldn't explain what happened to him. Maybe you don't feel you deserve it and you didn't expect it, but the truth is it's in your life, and God's using it. And God's glory is more important than your comfort. And so what do you do in response? Well, let me tell you what you don't do. You don't get angry. You don't question God's justice. But you reaffirm yourself. You cling to your theology that says God is good, God is a Father, and God's glory is more important than my comfort. And Lord, use this for your glory and my good. Someone said it like this: a prayer in the middle of suffering says, "Oh God, I trust you. I don't know why I'm going through this. If there's something that I can learn, wonderful. If there's something someone else can learn, great. Just get me through it. Hold me close. Deepen me. And change me." That's a great prayer in the middle of suffering, that trusts in a God that by nature is loving and by nature is our Father.